room too, it seems like so impersonal. Okay, and so the lens that I bring to this work is that I am a former foster youth from New York City. I aged out of the system in 2008, but still received services till 2009. I went to law school knowing that I wanted to do public interest work, and the first thing I did coming out of law school was represent young folks in abuse and neglect cases, and then eventually juvenile delinquency arraignment proceedings in New York City and Queens and Manhattan. And what really struck me in doing this work was seeing things kind of come full circle of being the young person on the youth side and knowing what that experience was like, and now having to advocate in this court system and kind of see what attorneys and judges in this system thought of the young folks and their families. I came out when I was 15, so I was out when I was in foster care. I spent pretty much all my teen years in foster care, and was out in foster care and definitely had a lot of different placements and worried about things that a lot of the young folks that I represented that were LGBTQ did, about the fact that you tend to have more placement changes and knowing whether or not placements were safe. So a lot of the work I did when I was representing young folks on the trial level was trying to make sure people understood things that they should be thinking about and flagging for young people, whether it was being in accepting foster homes to being able to make sure that young folks weren't being misgendered in the courtroom and by their caseworkers, et cetera. So we can go to the next slide. That was just the description, which you all have, that first slide. So I just wanted to start with a baseline, because some of you may be aware of this, but just in case you're not, I wanted to at least give some statistical background to the work that I focus on, which is child welfare and juvenile justice. So LGBTQ youth represent 29%, LGB youth represent 29%, and transgender youth 4% of the overall youth who are homeless in the US, and 30.4% of LGBT youth are youth in foster care, and many of them are youth of color. The statistics vary, 13 to 52% of young folks in foster care, it varies based on state, right, have had some sort of psychotropic med administered to them, given to them, prescribed to them, compared to stats that show only 4% of youth who are not in the foster care system have ever been prescribed a psychotropic medication. 1 in 9 Black youth and 1 in 20 Latinx youth, and when it says Black, a lot of times it's saying African American, because you can be Latinx and Black, I am. But just for the statistic purposes, so you understand, would have had a parent who was incarcerated at some point, and as I saw in my work and what some of you may know from some of the young folks that you may have in your classrooms or work with, a lot of them will encounter the child welfare system because they have a parent or possibly both that were incarcerated. And there's multiple studies. It hasn't really improved since I was in foster care in the early 2000s, that at least half of Black youth and half of Native youth would have encountered the child welfare system through some sort of investigation during their time in their childhood. And so I say this just to point out, LGBTQ youth, youth of color, encounter the foster care system and child welfare system in general, even if they don't end up in child welfare, at alarming rates, right? And that's something that we should care about, even before, as we see now, there's laws talking about, with gender affirming care and whether or not, parents, if they provide care to their trans child, are committing child abuse, right? Before all these things were happening, LGBTQ youth were in these systems in mass, and youth of color, and many of them were LGBTQ and youth of color. And that's still something that's happened for decades. It's happened since I was in foster care, and we have to make sure that we're not forgetting about these young people when we think about LGBTQ advocacy. We can go to the next slide. So that's kind of big enough. Can I get a volunteer to like just like read that quote out loud? Anybody?
We should consciously avoid inflicting psychological and emotional damage for children in our efforts to achieve physical safety by protecting, quote, the integrity of the parent-child relationship whenever possible.
So, and like I said, I really tried to like truncate so many different concepts here. But a lot of the work that I do is focusing on more of an abolitionist framework, the child welfare system and juvenile justice system. Young folks do better when they're at home with their parents if they can be, or with families, that anyone who's close to them if they can, obviously. And also children do better when they're not locked in cages, right? We see from the criminal justice system, the same way in the juvenile justice system, that, you know, recidivism and these hopes and things of incarceration don't really work. And what actually does work is community supports and services for young folks and for their families. And so this this quote basically talks about, you know, and I think it kind of ties nicely to like some of what the last presentation talked about. So, you know, in the guise of doing child welfare work and advocacy, it's a lot of what we're trying to do what's in their best interest and prevent harm. But the parent-child relationship should be, you know, protected. There's trauma as soon as you enter into the child welfare system. As soon as there's investigation, whether or not you're removed or not, it affects the family dynamic, it affects your household, and if you're removed, you know, it does irreparable damage, you know, to the young person for the rest of their life. I've had foster siblings who've never been able to connect with their family members. I have fractured relationships with different parts of my family from going through the system. And so we really need to talk about how, in the guise to try to protect, we're causing a lot of harm in these systems. And this quote was actually from a former Associate Commissioner of the Children's Bureau, which on the federal level deals with child welfare funding and grants and policies. We can go to the next slide. And so, just to give you the foundation on the juvenile justice side, like I did on the child welfare side, LGBT youth, because a lot of the stats sometimes have separate for trans, but LGBT youth make up 7 to 9%, excuse me, of the overall population in the US. However, they make up 20% of the youth in the juvenile justice system. And of that, 85% of those youth are youth of color. So, of the LGBT youth in juvenile justice systems, 85% of them are youth of color. So this is a racial justice issue. This is an LGBTQ rights issue. These are intrinsically intertwined. And so when we think about this work, we can't separate the two. And I think I heard a comment in one of the presentations earlier, you know, I'm a firm believer in like making sure that our racial justice movements, disability rights, you know, LGBTQ rights are all working together because we're all fighting these, you know, same oppressive systems. And so we have to make sure, and especially, you know, the LGBTQ rights movement definitely has some ways to go. You know, I come from the legal side, and a lot of times LGBTQ folks of color are not who get highlighted as key plaintiffs. They're not who get highlighted in what work is focused on. Even though they're most marginalized, they're dealing with the most harm, most instability in housing, underemployment, food instability, you know, child welfare, juvenile justice system, you name it. And so that focus is not necessarily there. And so in the work that I do, I try to make sure that everything that I'm working on is coming from racial justice lens, LGBTQ rights lens, disability rights lens. My brother, I'm his guardian, he's an adult with autism, and I, you know, have parents who have mental illness, and so, you know, for me, it hits home, and I saw how the system treated my brother, who they never let us ever live together when we were in the system, because he, you know, his disabilities were too severe, even though we lived at home for years, until like at mid-adolescence. But his disabilities were too severe for him to live with me, and he was institutionalized and placed in higher levels of care that he didn't need. And it took a lot of years to kind of deprogram. And he still to this day writes his name sometimes on items or puts bags over items because he got so institutionalized that like you have to keep your stuff separate and this is yours, this is theirs. And I had to kind of integrate him to learn how to live back in a family unit. And so like these separations and these harms of these systems, like it doesn't just affect the young person while they're a child, it continues to affect them as an adult. And I really think that it's important when you talk about this work, like we talk about addressing the trauma and limiting the trauma. And that's trying to make sure that young folks don't encounter these systems if they don't need to. And personally, I think they never need to. I think we should put more funding in community supports and resources in education instead of jail cells, instead of increased foster care, which we know from statistics doesn't work as well as we think it does. It makes us feel good, but you know, the trauma that young folks go through and the challenges they suffer with education and change placements, you know, is foster care really helping us at all? And so I think that it's important to have that kind of framework because I know a lot of folks that don't work in the child welfare, juvenile justice, and sometimes don't think of those systems in that way. And you all working in the education field, you know, many of you, if not most of you, might be mandated reporters, and so you may have learned about, you know, child abuse and neglect and have a different lens of it. But coming from representing, you know, young folks in family court, most of the issues were never anything related to actual real abuse. In the sense of what you would think, actual real physical. A lot of it was mental health, substance abuse, housing insecurities. I saw families who had loss in their life and that caused them to hoard and they're like, oh, the house is too dirty and it's not safe for a child. That's majority of what actually comes through the family court system, not what you see, you know, on, you know, the news stories. They want to highlight that 1 or 2% where a child may be severely hurt or, you know, may have died, and that does happen. Obviously there's so many things that happen in this world and we don't really understand why, but we need to like demystify and like de-villainize like what the child welfare system really is, because you know the parents are not villains. They're going through a lot of different things and they're trying to do the best that they can most of the time, and so we need to kind of focus on how we can support the family unit, because when the child leaves the system, that's still their family. And so a lot of the work that I saw was like bifurcated youth and parent justice. And so a lot of what I try to do is, you know, do presentations with youth, with parent organizations, and try to like collaborate on, you know, different projects with them, just so that we know like we should be working together for families. I wanted to show really quickly, the next slide should have it. Yes. I'm sorry, could you pause it for 1 second?
Play any role in making sure how?
Yeah, so just because I realized I didn't know where the slides were going to show up, but in case you didn't catch the writing. So the Office of Health and Human Services invited trans youth and their parents down to DC to kind of like a trans youth roundtable to talk to them about like some of the things that they care about, that they're passionate about, and to reaffirm that like on the federal level that there are policies in place that do protect, you know, and we had a whole presentation on the word protect, but that do support trans youth, essentially, right? And so this is just like a brief clip, but I just always try to, if I can't have a young person actually be with me on the stage, like find a way to include their quotes or at least something from an actual young person, because I think it's important to hear things in their own words. So if you could hit play again, thank you.
HHS play any role in making sure health, safety, peace of mind comes to the family. Our doors are open.
We look forward to hearing from each of you because we really are here to listen to you.
I'd like to start by thanking both the Department of Health and Human Services for giving us this space just talk and tell you our stories of who we are. Transgender, binary families, youth are just like everyone else. And all we're asking for is to be treated with dignity and respect like everyone else. This is not a choice. No one is pressuring me to be this way. No one is telling me that this is how I have to be. This is my decision. And it's not even a decision. It's more of my myself.
I have been the target of bullying.
How easy to speak up?
It's very difficult. There have been times where I'm like holding back tears.
We've been reported to CPS in Florida multiple times. Strangers who report my husband and I and our family for child abuse, simply for affirming her and for loving her and letting her be who she is.
Gender-affirming care is a part of the well-being of children.
We have an administration and leadership that really gets it and wants to do what's right.
At the end of the day, this is all about the youth. So to each and every one of you who stood up and told your story and did it so well, I just want to say thank you for making us proud. Please know that we want to be there with you whatever way we can, and we'll get there. We'll get there.
Produced by the Police Department of Health and Services.
Yeah, so I like to show that, like I said, to include some youth voices, but also just to throw in on the federal level, there are different protections, and I know the earlier presentation mentioned about Bostock, which affects Title VII employment, but also Fair Housing Act, Title IX, all protect against sex discrimination, and also under equal protection. And so there's a lot of statutes and laws on the federal level that do protect LGBTQ young folks on the federal level. And so, it does get, good to have whole presentations about this, but it gets complicated, on the state level. How does federal things come into play? But I do like to at least mention to folks that, like, if you're in a state that doesn't have supportive policies, you can still make report, all these state sites, Office of Civil Rights, Department of Ed, on their websites, they have complaint forms that you can make, and they're not gonna know about particular issues if you don't mention it to them. That doesn't mean that they're gonna be able to get involved in every single instance, but there have been times where on the federal level, they have sought to sue or sent letters to states letting them know that they don't think that they're complying with different federal statutes. And so it is important for folks to know, even if you're in states where there's laws that are unfavorable, on the federal level, there are certain protections that you can at least, go on a government website and make a report about it. There's, like I said, it could be a whole presentation about like what rights later you may have then to sue. Under Title VII, you have to go through the EEOC and get a right to sue letter. There's a lot of things there. But just so people know that there are protections. So even if your state doesn't have, don't feel that that's, the end. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep fighting on, the state level for the changes that you want. Because as we all know, what happens on the state level affects a lot of our day-to-day lives, more so than the federal level at times, just because of how things are structured in this country. We can go to the next slide. I think I'm doing okay on time. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that I've been working on at NCLR and my advocacy. Some of it is on bills and statutes that have been going through the California and the New York legislature, but I wanted to highlight some California bills. So last year we were a co-sponsor for the Youth Bill of Rights, which was a bill that advocated for an update to the Youth Bill of Rights for young folks in California who are incarcerated. There wasn't a Bill of Rights for them that was issued as far back as 2008. And what's happening in California is a lot of young folks are moving to, that are still incarcerated and moving to the county level. And so the current Bill of Rights, the way it was written, wouldn't apply to them. And so we took the opportunity to advocate to update, because there was a lot of changes in the law, especially added protections for LGBTQ youth in terms of discrimination. And so having extra language, and now young folks who are incarcerated have to be informed about their rights. It has to be posted. There was also a bill that passed previously that went into effect in 2023 for Office of Ombudsman, and so now young folks can make reports if they feel like their rights are being violated in juvenile facilities, and so there's definitely a lot of changes that are happening now in California due to this. And last year, there were a number of bills that we supported that ended up passing in legislature that had a big effect on young folks who were incarcerated. Youth custodial interrogation, so deceptive interrogation practices for young folks by police officers. There is direct statute now that they can't do, engage in certain deceptive acts to coerce young folks to make, statements against their interest. Youth electronic monitoring. California had 10,000 youth who were under electronic monitoring. And so this statute worked to limit the time they spent on monitors because it was treated a little bit different than the adult level. And then juvenile dismissals, working toward, dismissing juvenile crimes, and then juvenile transfers. So young adults getting transferred to juvenile courts instead of like adult level. And then this year, we've been working, and I don't have it up on here because it's a recent development. There's currently a bill, SB 407, which is supporting affirming foster homes for youth in California that we are supporting, and some of our coalition partners are really pushing for in California. Also, which is up there, AB 544, is a bill that's pushing for voting rights access for individuals in correctional facilities, and so this would apply for youth and adults. And so this bill actually, and if you care about voting rights issues, like it's, very much trampled on for incarcerated people, and so this bill would make sure that like the information is there so people can register and actually vote while they're incarcerated. And so this is, a very important bill that I'm hoping, even if it doesn't, pass this legislative year, that there's, push to keep this forward, because I think it would be a good example to have for other states as well. And AB 505, I mentioned the ombudsman process. This process for this bill is looking at creating an Office of Youth and Community Restoration and kind of changing who now oversees juvenile facilities. Right now, the entity that does it also oversees adult facilities, and different things can slip through the cracks, and adults and youth are different. And so a lot of states usually have a separate office that oversees juvenile facilities, that their rights aren't violated, and that there's as much oversight as possible. You can go to the next slide. And so I personally, mainly because with the work that I do, I don't really work on the anti-trans legislation. Some of my colleagues at NCLR does. And so if you look at our website, NCLR is one of the organizations that brought suit in Florida related to the bans here in other states as well. But I thought it was important to uplift some positive legislation that is happening that we can support and know about. So on the federal level, just on March 29th, the Rise Up for LGBTQI Youth in Schools resolution was introduced, and they asked a lot of organizations to sign on in support of it. NCLR signed on, and this was something that I put the link there. GLSEN really worked hard on to help advocate for this resolution, and so I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave them out in the site. But this resolution really just upholds that young people who are LGBTQ have basic civil human rights and should be treated with respect and dignity in schools. And in New York, there's some bills that have been, some of which have been pending since 2017 to 2019, such as comprehensive sex education, LGBTQI curriculum, LGBTQ inclusive curriculum, and recently now there's a TG and CNB anti-discrimination bill that's pending in the legislature. It doesn't seem, we just had a recent advocacy day, it doesn't seem like these bills, may pass this year, but I definitely wanted to highlight them here because in prior work that I've done in doing, in New York City, we actually have like a gay straight alliance summit. It was, virtual one year during COVID. But, in speaking directly with like young folks in the schools, this is something that they care about. And these bills have been lingering, and a lot of young people say that, having these bills where they get to learn about LGBTQ people throughout their, curriculum, included in different subject areas, and also comprehensive sex ed would help improve things for their experience in the schools. And a lot of people think of New York as like the most liberal place ever. But, there's definitely disparities between, there's more, statutes and policies in the New York City level than there is in New York State. And so there's definitely parts of New York State that don't have the same protections as they have in the city level, and a lot of times, can feel neglected. And everybody, a lot of people, when they think of New York, they think of New York City, but much of the state encompasses, a region that has a lot of rural areas, a lot of, suburban dense areas that don't see a lot of the same support. So having these kinds of bills passed would make a big difference in their school districts that it might not make in some New York City schools where they may have already implemented policies. Because on the New York City level, there is a policy to include LGBTQ awareness in the curriculum. But even then, that can vary depending on if the teacher wants to use that information or not. And having spoken directly to young folks in middle school and high school, some of them were not even aware that on the city level that this was something that was supposed to be told to them, and even staff that were there. So I think this kind of ties into even when you get good policy, good state statutes, there still has to be some sort of oversight to make sure these things are being used and utilized. And so I just wanted to highlight, if folks in New York, if they don't already know about these bills, educators, people, working in education, for them to uplift, and hopefully, at some point in the recent years, we can see them pass. And then the next slide, because we're wrapping up here, if you scan the QR code, I have for all these different resources, like an actual info sheet, so you can share it with young folks or keep it for yourselves. These are some programs that the National SOGI Center, who's one of our coalition partners, that they have been working on, and they did a 5-year project where they, in different jurisdictions, implemented some of these programs and saw vast improvements in either LGBTQ youth being able to stay with their families. So the Youth Acceptance Project works to kind of bridge the gap where parents who are having a hard time accepting their child as being LGBTQ, they try to work with the parents and also the young person to meet them where they are so that they can kind of foster that relationship to avoid the child leaving the home and to avoid removal, right? And then Journey Ahead is a therapeutic program, chosen affirming, family finding. They actually work with different foster care agencies to help LGBTQ foster youth locate other family members. And they've been successful at shifting in 5 years the percentage of LGBTQ folks who had a close family connection or were able to change their resource. Because a lot of times the workers were busy and overloaded, and there was a lot of folks that they didn't even think about contacting, and through the CAF project work, they were able to even just to find someone, the young person, they went to a family day where it was a barbecue and they got to meet all of their a bunch of their family, just knowing that they still have that support and those connections there, because a lot of the caseworkers are very busy, they are overloaded, and a lot of times it's information they don't know or they may have not taken the time to gather. So this project really focuses on talking with the young person and finding out who's your support system, whether that's biological family, non-biological, who are your support system, who do you want us to reach out to, and let's find it, and let's at least make sure, even if you end up staying in the foster care system, that you have some adults that you can turn to, for support. And so I just wanted to share those resources with you all so that, you can share them out with the families and the young people that you work with. And the last slide just has NCLR's legal helpline. You can make a request via phone or online. NCLR is a national organization. It's based in California, but it's a national organization. And so if you call the helpline, doesn't matter what state you're in. A lot of the work we do comes from all across the country. And we have a lot of connections with the legal nonprofits in different parts of the country. Our helpline director is really good in maintaining those relationships, but also, with different law firms across the country. So it's a great resource to have if anyone has questions about, their rights as an LGBTQ person, youth, adults. It's a good starting place, because if it's not something that we could do, we tend to do policy and more impact lit, though we do some direct service depending, on the circumstances. That's mainly on the family law end. But it's a good resource because, we never leave you hanging. We share resources with you. We try to connect you with attorneys, organizations in your area, if it's not something that we can, directly work on. So I just wanted to share that as a resource for folks. And then it's a couple minutes after, but if anyone had any questions, I know that was a lot of information, but I hope the resources are helpful. And definitely feel free, to reach out to us at any time if you have any, legal questions for LGBTQ young folks and their families. So I used to do, I still do advocacy now, mainly with the advocacy orgs on the ground, like Equality New York. There's also, in May, there's going to be an LGBTQ advocacy day. A lot of stuff has kind of changed over the years. So I've been participating on the state level since before NCLR, when I was representing youth in family court. On the different advocacy days that are set up. We just, in March, had an advocacy day for sex worker rights, because we have a current bill now that's been pending for a while in passing legislation to protect sex workers in New York. So a lot of what I do is more direct with different nonprofits. Make the Road is a big coalition partner in New York that does a lot of LGBTQ advocacy. So yeah, I don't particularly work with a particular, senator. I more participate in the legislative meetings that we have with them to encourage them to support the bills that I mentioned and other bills as well, like for foster youth, increased education assistance, et cetera. So. Anyone have any other questions? Yeah, so NCLR is a nonprofit, so we provide free legal assistance to folks. We do have pro bono partners that we work with, and a lot of the other legal LGBTQ orgs have a similar structure, but their sizes are different. We're a pretty small org, about 40 or so people, but we do work on the national level. So a lot of LGBTQ orgs are similar. Most of them are nonprofits that have pro bono partners. So, I usually, you think of the big national players like, Lambda Legal, ACLU on the, federal and the state level, NCLR, TILDEF. you know, and try to give folks that information. But, you know, depending on what their issue is, you know, a lot of the work that those orgs do is more impact and policy. But we do have, you know, connections on the local level. So it's always good to kind of start there if you don't know anything in your area, to start with those orgs and see if they can connect you with like resources on the ground. And I always tell people to, you know, look up your local county bar association. What a lot of people don't know is that they all have like referral, attorney referral lines, and you can do a 30-minute session with an attorney for like a nominal amount. Usually I've seen it no more than like $50. And even if they're not LGBTQ, and a lot of people don't know this, and so, because attorneys are expensive to access, but this is a way you can have a quick consultation to kind of know what your legal rights are. Do you even have recourse to bring a case or anything like that? And looking up like whatever area you're in or county, like legal service, legal aid in that area, because a good amount of organizations now usually have the LGBTQ project or center, or at least have some folks that are focusing on LGBTQ work. So it's good to think about on, you know, your state and local level, looking up like if there's a legal aid or a legal services in your area. But it does, you know, vary. Like in certain parts of South and Midwest, you may not see as much as you might see on the East Coast and the West Coast. But that's why starting sometimes with the national orgs are good, because usually they have different relationships with folks across the country to connect. Because it, you know, it definitely can be expensive to just, you know, I always tell people to start there before you start thinking to hire like an attorney, obviously, unless you have the means to. I focus on youth, but yes, we do we do work on LGBT issues for adults as well. So, you know, we have different, you know, projects that work on health. Some folks are working on the sports bans. You know, our organization was involved in a lot of the same-sex marriage cases that passed, especially our legal director championed a lot of those cases. So, yeah. So if you look on the website, when you go to like the Get Help section, it has a list of some things, but if you also look at like resources, it has a list of like all our different like project areas. Okay, well, I don't want to hold you all up because I know you have one more presenter and it's been a long day, and I know everybody's had some travel stuff. I know I did. But thank you so much for having me here. I don't know if I'm the only attorney here, but thanks for letting me into this space, because I think it's important for us to, you know, build these connections, because we're all working with the same, you know, young people and families. So thank you for having me.
Once again, the QR code for this presentation is out in the front on the desk, so you can get that information. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes. 5 minutes. The boss has spoken. 5 minutes, and then we will resume with Tom Edwards, who once again is I believe the last remaining LGBTQ member of the school board in Florida, and he has been directly targeted by Governor DeSantis for defeat, and members of his own school board and his community in public forums have called for him to be removed because he is a groomer, which they have yelled at him, and he, as was discussed, is taking away our youth's innocence, which has been in papers across the country. So enjoy your bathroom run, and we'll see you in 4 minutes now. Anybody who's staying, please just move up a little or sit so we can get going. Here he is. As you all know, Florida has declared itself ground zero for much of the anti-LGBTQ plus legislation and policies that are going on in the United States and influencing some of the other parts of the world right now. The major target has been education in a false pretense to protect children, whatever that means, as we've discussed. The reality is, excuse me in the back, please either come sit. The reality is that we're not protecting anyone, we're not helping anyone, we're causing more trouble than it's worth, and we're putting more pressure on young people and their families, as well as teachers and communities. A stalwart in fighting back, a stalwart in calling out the governor and the people who are pushing these policies has been Tom Edwards, who is an elected school board member in Sarasota County. He may be one of the very few progressive, mindful human beings that still hold an office in this state. And now you're going to hear from him and hear his story, and then we will open it up to a short interview and questions. So, Tom, it's all yours. Don't talk yet, the sound isn't on. So give us a second. Oh, you're on mute, or your microphone's not on? So once again, while we're waiting, the chair of the school board in Sarasota is one of the founding members of Mothers for Liberty, a strong proponent for book bans, a strong proponent for taking money out of the public schools, a strong proponent of Governor DeSantis, and she sits on the Disney. You're here?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go on.
Perfect. Okay, it's good to see all of you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. My schedule just didn't work out. But I hope to leave you with a profound, hopeful message included: peacefully taking to the streets, sit-ins, letter writing, phone campaigns, and quality media reporting that was designed to raise public awareness and influence the local, the state, and the federal politicians. That was the era I grew up in, and it has forever shaped my views of civic responsibilities and good governance. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new era of civil unrest. The 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s were the era where we began to see and enjoy the fruits of our labors. The Vietnam War ended, education began to be more balanced and inclusive, civil rights and voting rights changed, in the name of equality. The understanding of diversity and acceptance began to flourish. Nixon resigned. Glass ceilings began to shatter. Roe versus Wade was the law of the land, and same-sex marriage was established. Elected officials were bipartisan friendly and listened to the moderate majority. We still had lots of work to do, but we could see the goals in sight. And then 4 things happened. The advent of social media and its weaponization, Fox News, 2 Obama presidential elections, and finally, Donald Trump. And thus, the country divided along party lines. But I'm here today to share some good news with you. Locally in my county, as the bullying that first started with the governor putting me on his target list, and then the head of the Republican Party calling me the most woke school board member in America, my name recognition began to grow. A spotlight was put on my pro-student, pro-community school board work. As the bullying continued by hateful anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric that was shared publicly by Moms for Liberty members, the community stepped up with hundreds of emails, text messages, letters to the editor, and op-eds, along with many social media posts pushing back on that bigotry. This awareness has led to an extraordinary involvement at our school board meetings and continuous emails that demand a less politically extreme agenda pushed by the current school board majority. The Moms for Liberty loud noise has finally become the minority voice, and this trend doesn't seem to be stopping. In speaking with other school board members around the state, they're feeling it too. Every time Tallahassee pushes another anti-public education or culture war bill, more people become engaged. Every time my fellow board members introduce a controversial agenda item, even more people become engaged. And that's only the education and culture war issues. What about the 6-week abortion ban and open carry? Yet even more people are becoming engaged. And here's why. These are issues that affect people from both sides of the aisle. Lots of Republican and independent voters have had to have abortions, and many have gay family members. Everyone wants good, age-appropriate public education to be provided to all students without censorship. Mass shootings continue to occur at an unprecedented rate. The extreme agenda is beginning to show cracks as more of our community members become engaged. Their extreme agenda is beginning to unite us, not divide us. And here is what we must do. We must lead by example and become more engaged, and do it visibly. Find good trouble and protest. Send emails to elected officials, including the school board. Send letters to the editor, and if you're comfortable, post social media, and comments are helpful. We need to create a safe space for those that are sitting on the sidelines to come out of the shadows and join this good governance movement. Lastly, and most importantly, support and encourage Gen Z. They are the ones that see their rights being eroded by this last dying attempt from older white legislators trying to retain power. Our activism will inspire and fuel them to save our democracy and return us to the days when our country elected a Black president and our rights and freedoms were respected, and we all had hope. This is what we must do to eliminate despair and bring back that hope.
Not, Diane.
Okay. Can you?
Abbreviated.
Oh my goodness. Okay, abbreviated. Okay. What is your opinion about me causing a little good trouble going into schools and mentioning sexual orientation and gender identity in a very age-appropriate way, being that as a teacher that's retired from New York, I don't have to worry about being docked or anything like that. Who would have my back?
That's a good question. I would tell you that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert, but one of the things that I think is important for us to all know is that Gen Z and Gen X parents, they really want diversity and inclusion. That's what my community woke up to when they heard the angry, hateful, grooming rhetoric, and it was insinuated, quite honestly, that I was in elementary classrooms grooming elementary kids because I'm gay, and that's a pretty shocking accusation. And it was ugly to everyone. So I'm not suggesting that we, the royal we, want to go in and rainbow flag only. What I am suggesting is that our communities want diversity, inclusion, and not to cancel, not to ban books, not to cancel Black history, not to whitewash. So I wouldn't necessarily go in from a militant perspective, but I would look to partner with teachers that are looking to have healthy conversation about age-appropriate sexual orientation, and I'm sure you can contribute to that. That would obviously be more on a high school level, so that we're not letting parents' rights, but in fact leaning into parents' rights, and that's really what I'm suggesting. Not to make it combative, but to make it parallel and to show we have nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing concerning about sexual orientation. I hate to answer this in a long-winded way, but quite honestly, today, and I'll ask this question of you guys, I was speaking at another event earlier today, and I asked the question in the room, how many people here have a sexual orientation? And everyone looked at me with this blank look on their face, and they finally all raised their hands. And I said, great. Now, let's just say that we all have a sexual orientation, and some of ours are different than others, and some are slightly modified and different than others. But the reality is we don't discuss sexual orientation in a non-age appropriate way in any classroom setting until it is age appropriate. And that's what's always happened. So I just point out, look to find a way to partner where it can help a teacher and not be perceived as just about being politically to be politically motivated.
Somebody else?
Hi, I'm Sav Bear. I'm a teacher in Seattle. I was wondering your thoughts on when you say age appropriate, do you feel like that's a concession that our existence as queer folk isn't appropriate for children? I mean, we don't need to be going into sex. Being queer isn't just about sex. But do you feel like there will be a time when you could take a stand and say it's all age appropriate to acknowledge that the people in history were queer?
Again, I think that age appropriate, when I use that phrase, that's a phrase that our legislature used to scare teachers that they were not teaching age-appropriate sexuality, whether it was heterosexual or LGBTQ+. So that age-appropriate is a phrase that's thrown about here in Florida. I believe that we're moving into a day, as long as we cast the net wide, that we want to teach history appropriately, whether it be sexual orientation, whether it be Black history, whether it be who our gay brothers and sisters were in history and who they are today. One of the important roles that I think I carry as a school board member isn't because I'm a gay man that's a school board member. I think I offer representation to our entire community, to our entire marginalized community. And that's important for all students to see, whether there's women on the dais, whether there's men on the dais, whether there's gay men on, whether there's race involved. I think that's what we're really trying to accomplish, is not to make us ever feel different, but 100% included.
Okay, back.
I'm Sydney G. I'm the mental health specialist at the Chicago Public Schools. And I just wanted to ask about what your perspective is as an elected official, right? Because the school board here is elected. Yeah, so that's awesome. And how do you engage with your constituents, just the people who you are responsible for and responsible to answer to? I know you mentioned engaging Gen Z and the youth in this work, but what sort of practical ways do you do that now?
As an elected official, I've made it my business to get to know my community. We have an incredible philanthropic community here and many nonprofit organizations that offer community support in various ways. Many of the people that are on the boards of those philanthropic organizations and nonprofit organizations are both Republican and Democrats. And when I function in the community, I don't function as a gay school board member. I function as a school board member that cares about students, and I look to find ways to enhance the relationships with those nonprofits and with those foundations for the best interest of our students. Another example that I've done is I've built a trades academy at one of our high schools. And I partnered with the Gulf Coast Builders Exchange, which is our local trade association for our commercial developers. And I was able to raise $360,000 to re-engineer an art class into a shop class. And here in Florida, there's a big push for career education. So I did that because I think that's good school board work. It had nothing to do with me being gay or straight. It had for doing that kind of work. And that's what I'm trying to explain in terms of our activism, and in terms of, is that we don't necessarily have to acknowledge our sexuality. I don't think straight people walk into a room and say, hey, by the way, I'm straight and I'm about ready to do some good quality work. And I'm just trying to say that that's where we have to be part of the community, the larger community, in the bigger way, and stand up for any bigotry and any racism. What I loved about your question that you didn't necessarily focus in on is your mental health background and how that relates to public schools. Here in Florida, we were in a mental health crisis before the pandemic, particularly in our school system, and the funding that I get from the state to take care of those kinds of services really only addresses kids in crisis. I have no money for counseling, behavioral counseling. I have no money for resiliency training to help kids stay out of crisis. And when I have conversations like what I'm having with you now, it's because I'm knowledgeable and I've done my due diligence and my good work as a school board member to be able to discuss, hey, we have a mental health crisis and that affects all our students. But beyond that, I will say, in the state of Florida, we've had several, to my knowledge, I know of several LGBTQ plus suicides in my county alone. And that's since the Don't Say Gay bill. And although I can't 100% attribute it to that bill, I can tell you that those students heard Don't Say Gay for 2 years. I will tell you that those kids heard that I was called a groomer, and that the people around, and so how does that affect the mental, and how about the CRT and the Black history? It goes on and on and on. And that's why I'm suggesting to us is that we want to embrace all kids, all races, all bigotry, because individually in our own individual silos, we're not large enough. We have to band together and say they're taking away all our rights one by one.
Anybody else? I just want to say that your litany of the history that you experienced growing up was interesting, because I also look at history in that context, but I also look at it that pre-Stonewall, we got very little attention for rising up. And then Stonewall happened, and then Pride, and all of these things happened in big ways, and the likelihood of going backwards seemed almost impossible. And then it was the AIDS crisis in Florida and parts of the United States, the Anita Bryant crisis. But with the fight against HIV/AIDS, there was ACT UP, and then there were all these health organizations that started to take care of people with HIV and AIDS. And those organizations are stronger today than they were then. The political organizations, the HRCs, the task force, are stronger today than they were then. They raise more money, they have more staff, they work on policy decisions in a way that was unimaginable at that time. So each and every time there's a crisis, each and every time there's an agenda, like marriage, like military service, it seems that we only get stronger. And my guess is that whatever comes out of this will ultimately make the organizations that serve the community that much stronger, and the community's resilience will show through, because the DeSantis mentality is on the losing end of history. And so I think that it conforms with what you said about the executions of 2 Kennedys and a King and all of those other things. But I think that that shell, that nut, that is the LGBTQ community, is so vitally important to the bigger picture, because it shows that not only can it be done by a marginalized community, but it can be done in partnership with the general community as well.
I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that I lived in Manhattan, and I was, ground zero for the AIDS crisis. We lived near St. Vincent's Hospital, and my view of the AIDS crisis, I had a house on Fire Island then. I was right in the thick of it. Thank God I was part of the founding folks that put together the gay men's health crisis, and I listened to Dr. Fauci over and over and over again as things materialized, that we learned how the virus was spread. But aside from that, I will tell you that, and that's the point of what I was really trying to talk about. We saw how bad things were in our country in the 60s and 70s, and people took to the streets. They did, the activism was fantastic. And the pendulum swung in our direction because of activism, because of our fighting back. And now the pendulum is swinging in the other direction. And if you pay attention to the history of civil rights, it does do that. It swings one way, and then, like the Obama election, woke up the Trumpers, and they suddenly had a voice to say that they were bigots and they were racist. So the pendulum swung in that direction. This pendulum is starting to swing back for us again, and we are stronger, and we are better, and we are smarter. That's why it's so important that we support Gen Z, that we lead by example for Gen Z. We show them the ways, and then we pass off the baton and let them do it, and let them make stronger and better laws. Let them elect stronger and better officials. Let them do all of the work, but better than we did it. But we can help them get there, and that's our job.
Any last statements? Any last questions? You're from Florida. Do you have anything to say?
Keep fighting the good fight and supporting your staff and schools.
Support your staff and schools. And parents, and children, and students.
And empower parents to know that the parental rights and education applies to our LGBT parents as well. So they can go in and request things like names and pronouns.
Absolutely. Parental rights apply to all parents, not select parents. So, Tom, thank you very much. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And I hope that I'll get over to Sarasota soon again. Thank you for closing out today's program and for giving a different insight than we might have had if it wasn't for someone who is actually in the thick of it and targeted. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good to see you all.
And thank you all for being here. Tomorrow, the programming is at Stonewall, and we have 3 or 4 programs. We will have fruit and water and stuff in the morning. So the programming starts at 9 a.m., and look forward to seeing you there. And thank you so much for participating in SNEP, and hopefully you will give us feedback so we can do it even better next time for the 11th. Have a good evening. And please take your guard.